At the restaurant, an adopted little boy notices a billionaire CEO eating with his wife and blurts out, "This man looks just like me." The man tries to maintain composure before freezing in horror at what happens next. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The clink of glasses and low thrum of conversation filled the softly lit restaurant, all muted elegance and polished wood. A trio of musicians played something smooth near the back wall. Matthew Hale sat at the centre of it all, every detail of the evening curated, from the corner table with its skyline view to the chilled bottle of Bordeaux the sommelier had opened without even needing to be asked. He'd won a major acquisition earlier that afternoon, the kind of boardroom triumph that made headlines and bumped stock prices. Across from him, Vanessa raised her glass with a small, knowing smile that barely touched her voice. "To strategic ruthlessness," she said. Matthew smiled, not quite looking her in the eye. "To never having to explain yourself." They clinked glasses. The wine was perfect. The steak on the way was imported. He had every reason to be content. But he kept glancing toward the window, as if checking the skyline to reassure himself that the world hadn't shifted beneath his feet. It did, though, about 5 minutes later. From 2 tables over came the unmistakable voice of a child, clear and curious and much too loud for polite company. "That man looks just like me." There was a pause, the kind that sucks the breath out of a room just before it erupts. A few heads turned, someone laughed. Then a second person joined in, and the tension broke like a snapped twig. Even the waiter standing nearby chuckled as he cleared a breadbasket. Matthew didn't move. His fork hung in midair, a piece of roasted beet skewered but forgotten. The colour drained from his face as he turned slightly, just enough to see the source of the voice. A little boy, 7, maybe 8, was sitting between 2 men, one with salt and pepper hair, the other younger, arms full of tattoos peeking from a button-down rolled to the elbow. The boy was poking at his spaghetti with a spoon, but he wasn't looking at the food, he was looking at Matthew, still staring. The boy's curls were thick and dark, slightly messy. His nose had that familiar slope. His expression was sharp in a way that didn't belong to a kid that age. He wasn't just being silly. He'd seen something and said it plainly, as kids do. Vanessa turned to see what the fuss was about, then smiled politely. "Poor kid, must be confusing me with someone famous." Matthew said nothing. She nudged him with her foot. "Relax. You do have a very standard finance guy face. It's a miracle they didn't clone you on the trading floor." He forced a laugh. "Right." She moved on, launching into a story about someone at the firm trying to poach her executive assistant. But Matthew barely heard her. The boy was still watching him, head tilted slightly like he was working out a puzzle. Then, as suddenly as it began, Johnny turned back to his plate and resumed eating like nothing had happened. But Matthew couldn't. He set his fork down slowly. "I'll be right back," he muttered. Vanessa looked up. "Everything okay?" "Just the wine. Too fast on an empty stomach." He didn't wait for a response. He walked across the dining room, his pace measured but tense, disappearing into the hallway, leading to the restrooms. Once he was out of view, he stepped into a stall, closed the door, and pulled out his phone with shaking hands. It took a few swipes to reach the folder. It wasn't labelled anything suspicious, just a string of random letters and numbers buried deep in cloud storage. He hadn't looked at it in years. The photo came up instantly. A woman sitting on a low stone wall outside a hotel in Las Vegas, wearing jeans and a tank top, her hair pulled into a lazy bun. She wasn't smiling, just squinting at the sun with one hand shielding her face. Lena. He hadn't thought about her in so long it felt like opening a door to another life. She'd been funny in a quiet, untrained way, smarter than she let on. It had been one night, one stupid, unplanned, completely unrepeatable night. Matthew scrolled down. There was a second photo, one she'd sent months later. A picture of a positive pregnancy test. No caption, no demand, just the image. He'd tried calling her then, but the number was disconnected. No one knew anything. She'd disappeared, and he hadn't tried hard enough to find her. He'd filed the memory away under things never spoken about, locked it in a mental box, and moved on. Until now. He stood there for a long moment, the phone heavy in his hand, his thoughts louder than anything else around him. He knew what he saw out there. That boy, that face, it wasn't a coincidence. The timeline fit. The resemblance was unmistakable now that he let himself look at it, without denial clouding his judgment. When he returned to the table, Vanessa had already ordered his entree for him and was halfway through her salad. "You were gone a while," she said casually. "Bathroom line?" He sat down, nodded. "Yeah, one of those nights." She reached across the table, brushing a crumb from his lapel. "You all right?" Of course. But he wasn't. He finished the meal distractedly, nodding at the right places, smiling when expected. The boys' table finished before theirs. As they left, the child glanced over one last time and gave a tiny wave, more like a flick of the hand than anything deliberate. Matthew didn't wave back. He couldn't. He was frozen, sitting there with half a glass of wine and a full weight on his chest. After the check was paid and the valet brought their car around, Vanessa slid in beside him, pulling her wrap tightly around her shoulders. "We should celebrate more often. You were weird tonight, but I'll assume it was nerves from the deal." He nodded, saying nothing. That night, long after she fell asleep beside him in their towering apartment above the park, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind ran through every possible version of what to do next. Ignore it. Investigate. Pretend. Confess. He didn't know which was worse. What he did know, though, was that nothing about this would stay buried anymore. Some truths waited. Some truths walked into restaurants and said, "Your face looked just like theirs." And some stared right back at you with a look you once saw in the mirror as a child, wondering how the world could make room for you in the first place. The boy's face stayed with him. Through the drive home, through Vanessa's chatter about her upcoming campaign launch, through brushing his teeth, folding his shirt, setting the alarm, Johnny's face kept flashing across his thoughts like a light flickering in a hallway he'd locked years ago. Matthew didn't sleep. He lay beside Vanessa in silence, counting the lines in the ceiling, until the room turned grey with morning. When her alarm buzzed, she kissed his shoulder and got up without asking why he hadn't moved all night. She noticed, of course. She always noticed. But she'd long since learned when not to press. He waited until she left before reaching out. Not to Vanessa, not to anyone close. He pulled up an old contact he hadn't touched in years, someone he'd used during a hostile takeover to find dirt on a rival's offshore holdings. Not exactly the kind of person you call twice in a lifetime. But Matthew needed answers, and fast. He didn't say much on the call, just gave the kid's first name, the likely age, and Lena's full name. Discreetly, he added, which went without saying. The phone call cracked something loose, and the memories returned with more clarity than he expected. It was 8 years ago, Vegas. Summer heat that clung to everything like melted plastic. He'd just landed a major promotion, Senior VP of Acquisitions, and was flown out with the other execs for a leadership summit. 3 days of panels and private poker tables, and the kind of handshakes that sealed billion-dollar deals over shrimp cocktails. Vanessa had flown out with him. They weren't married yet, but close. Engaged for a year and in no rush. At the time, things were tense. She wanted to pause her career to go back to school for a second degree, something in international law. He didn't support it. Or rather, he supported it in theory, but not in timing. She accused him of being dismissive. He said she was being impulsive, the usual cycle. That night, they fought just before a dinner event. She stormed off. He stayed behind and drank. The scotch was free, the casino floor welcoming. He didn't remember much about the first part of the evening, just that the lights were too bright and everything buzzed slightly. He won a little, lost more, drifted into the bar to reset. That's where he met Lena. She was working a double shift, didn't smile much, didn't flirt like the others. She poured drinks quickly and spoke like someone who didn't care whether you tipped. That's probably what made her stand out. No performance, no sweetness. Just a girl who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. He asked her if she was always this cheerful. She said only when she was getting robbed. He laughed. She didn't. But eventually, she softened. They talked. He didn't tell her who he was. She didn't ask. Somewhere between last call and sunrise, they ended up in a room that wasn't his. He remembered how quiet she was after, the way she'd sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the carpet like it might tell her something useful. He left before checkout. 2 months later, the envelope arrived. It wasn't forwarded through the company or routed by any legal firm. It came to his apartment in Manhattan, addressed in careful, looping script. Inside, there was no note, just a photo of a pregnancy test and a phone number written beneath it. He stared at it for an hour before dialing. It rang twice and went dead. He tried again and again. The line had already been shut off. He thought about hiring someone back then, thought about looking her up, but he didn't. Too risky, too messy. He didn't know what she wanted. Maybe she was bluffing. Maybe she didn't want anything. And he was weeks away from marrying Vanessa. He convinced himself that silence was her choice, that if she really needed something, she'd have followed up. He filed the envelope away in a locked drawer and never told a soul. Not even during therapy sessions, where he talked about his father's cruelty or his fear of repeating it. He could admit to being cold, ambitious, emotionally unavailable. But not that. Not the mistake that might have turned into a child he never met. And now here he was, years later, trying to track down a boy whose spaghetti dinner had unraveled the thread he spent almost a decade pretending didn't exist. A few days passed with no update from the investigator. Matthew tried to keep himself busy with meetings and calls, but he wasn't all there. He kept checking his phone between Zoom calls, waiting for a text or an email, something to confirm what he already knew. Meanwhile, Vanessa noticed. Not just the distraction, she was used to that, but something else. He was cagey, guarded. Saying he had early meetings, coming home late, checking his phone under the table. She didn't say anything at first, just started making small mental notes. He'd done this once before, right after his father's funeral, when the grief cracked him open and he'd shut her out completely. But this didn't feel like that. It felt like something newer and older. Something alive and urgent. She checked his calendar. She checked his location history. Then she downloaded a tracking app, just in case. That Thursday, he said he had a late investor dinner. Instead, he drove across the city to an address the investigator had sent him, a row of townhouses in a quiet part of Brooklyn. He parked half a block away, rolled down the window, and watched. A man with a grey beard stepped out first, locking the front door. Then came the boy, bouncing ahead of a second man who wore jeans and a hoodie and looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Johnny. Same curls, same way of walking, same nose. Matthew didn't get out of the car. He just sat there, parked in the shadows, heart thudding. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Back at home that night, Vanessa asked how dinner went. He said it was productive. She kissed his cheek, watched him walk into his office, and stared at the phone in her hand. She had a screenshot of his location. She didn't recognize the address, but something told her the lie he was telling wasn't about work or another woman. She wasn't sure which possibility scared her more. The next morning, the report was waiting in his inbox. A PDF, 10 pages, straight to the point. The investigator had been thorough, public records, birth certificate scans, a few grainy photos, even notes from a social worker's file. Matthew read it all at his kitchen counter, coffee untouched, the sun barely up. Lena Sanders had given birth at a public hospital in Queens. No emergency contact, no insurance. She died a few hours later from complications. The baby, healthy but premature, had no listed father. Within weeks, the adoption had gone through. Greg and Jonas, both cleared and pre-approved by the agency, had taken the boy home. There was no legal trail connecting Matthew to Johnny. No one had ever known. No one except Lena. And she was gone. For 7 years, he'd existed outside that boy's world, not even as a rumor. Now he couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he'd stared. The confidence in his voice, that odd, easy acceptance only kids could offer. Matthew didn't want to show up uninvited. He also didn't want to do nothing, so he compromised with himself. There was a used bookstore on Smith Street, not far from where the report said Greg often took Johnny on Sunday mornings. A small place, cluttered but quiet, the kind of shop that smelled like old paper and stronger coffee. He went there 2 weekends in a row, buying nothing, pretending to flip through biographies he had no intention of reading. The third weekend, they came in. Johnny spotted him first, walked right up and said, "Hey, it's the restaurant guy." Greg, mid-conversation with the clerk, turned just in time to see Matthew crouch slightly, not quite smiling. "Hi," Matthew said. "You're Johnny, right?" Johnny nodded. "Did you know you look like me?" Greg froze. He didn't say anything at first, but his entire posture shifted, shoulders up, ready to step between them. Matthew stood. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at Greg now. "This probably feels weird. I know who you are. I know who he is. I didn't come here to mess anything up." Greg stared. "What do you want?" Matthew hesitated, glancing down at Johnny, who was now flipping through a dog-eared children's book. "Can we talk? Just us?" "No. I understand. But I really do need 5 minutes. Somewhere neutral. No tricks." Greg didn't answer right away, but later that week, he called. The bookstore clerk had apparently vouchsafed that Matthew didn't loiter in a creepy way and hadn't said anything strange to Johnny before. They met in a coffee shop with bad lighting and even worse music. Matthew didn't try to ease into it. He told Greg the truth. Not everything, not Vegas, not the drinking, not Vanessa, but enough. Enough for Greg to go quiet for a long time after. "He doesn't know anything," Greg finally said. "Not about her, not about being adopted. We were going to wait." Matthew leaned forward slightly. "Do you love him?" Greg looked at him like the question didn't deserve a response. "We fought 3 years for that kid. We read 12 books about parenting. We went to every home study, every court date. We love him so much it terrifies us. Matthew nodded. Then you'll understand that I'm not here to take anything away from him, or from you. I just want to know him, if you let me. Greg didn't promise anything, but he didn't hang up when Matthew called again 2 days later. Eventually, after enough cautious, dry conversations, Greg relented. He set the terms. Only when Jonas was present, only in public places, no unsupervised moments, no talk about paternity. Matthew agreed to all of it. The first time they met at the toy store, Johnny came out of the gate swinging. Are you rich? He asked. You look like someone who tells people they're wrong for a living. Matthew nearly choked. Kind of. I used to be a CEO. Johnny nodded. That explains your shoes. From then on, the visits became semi-regular. Ice cream in the park. Walks through the Science Museum. A visit to an arcade, where Johnny beat Matthew at 3 games in a row and gave him a sticker that said, Participant. The boy was funny, without meaning to be, wildly opinionated, and had a fascination with whales and space. Matthew listened more than he talked. Johnny filled the silence effortlessly. One afternoon, while waiting in line for hot dogs, Johnny looked up at him and said, You're not like my dad's. How so? You're quieter, but you think loud. Matthew didn't know what to say to that. He laughed, uncomfortable, and asked if he wanted ketchup or mustard. Johnny shrugged and said both. At some point, Greg's demeanor shifted from open hostility to reluctant acceptance. Jonas, on the other hand, remained suspicious. He didn't speak much during the visits, but always kept a close watch, arms crossed, jaw set. Matthew didn't blame him. He'd spent 7 years vanishing from a life he didn't even know he'd helped create. Now he was reappearing like nothing had happened. It was on one of these visits, an afternoon at a Lego exhibit downtown, that Vanessa followed him. She'd already known something was off. The tracking app confirmed locations that had nothing to do with meetings or investor events. And once, the pin had stayed in one spot for over 2 hours, a public park near a school. She didn't ask questions. She waited, watched. She followed him in a cab that afternoon, 2 cars behind, sunglasses on, scarf pulled tight. She watched from across the street as he walked beside a boy, holding a bright green juice pouch and talking non-stop. She saw Matthew kneel, laughing at something the boy said. The boy tugged at his sleeve and handed him a Lego figure like it was some sacred treasure, and Matthew didn't hesitate. He took it, held it like it meant something. Vanessa didn't go over. She didn't make a scene. She just stood there long enough to be sure of what she'd seen, then turned and walked away, each step quieter than the last. That night, she said nothing. They had dinner like usual, watched part of a documentary, even climbed into bed at the same time. But there was a new silence between them, not cold, not angry, just waiting. And Matthew knew it. He felt it as he lay there, eyes open in the dark, thinking of a boy who looked like him and a woman he hadn't thought about in 8 years, but now couldn't forget. Vanessa waited, not hours, not days, weeks. She watched his patterns, tracked the names on his calendar, and read the quiet shifts in his mood. There was a new calmness in him, but it wasn't peace. It was the stillness of someone waiting to be caught. He was polite, more attentive than usual, but his attention was rehearsed. Like a man going through the motions of a life he'd already stepped out of. She stopped asking questions and started planning instead. She set the date for a Friday night. Nothing too formal, just dinner at home, a handful of guests. 2 of their closest friends, both lawyers, a colleague from her firm, and Matthew's assistant Neil, who'd always been awkward in social settings, but had a dependable memory when it came to detail. Vanessa sent out the invites herself and ordered catering from the place Matthew liked when he wanted to feel casual but important. Then she waited again, this time for the moment she could look him in the eye and ask the question she'd been carrying around like a hot stone pressed into her chest. The evening started normally. The apartment looked like something out of a design magazine. Warm lighting, soft jazz, wine flowing. Vanessa wore a simple black dress and gold earrings he'd bought her on their second anniversary. Matthew greeted everyone like he hadn't been hiding anything. He poured drinks, cracked jokes, told the story about the investor who'd tried to pay for a startup with cryptocurrency and had lost half of it to a phishing scam. Vanessa watched closely. She noticed how easily he smiled, how relaxed he seemed. Too relaxed. She asked about his week, his meetings, his so-called investor retreat. He didn't flinch. Neil chimed in about some scheduling confusion, but Matthew brushed it off with a laugh, saying the GPS must have glitched. No one caught the slip. No one but her. She waited until the guests left. Matthew helped clean up, gathering glasses, rinsing dishes, humming something low under his breath. She didn't interrupt. She let him finish, watched him wipe his hands on a dish towel, and pour himself one last inch of wine. Then she placed the envelope on the counter between them. He looked at it, then at her. She didn't speak. He picked it up slowly, like it might bite. Inside was a printout, adoption records, nothing dramatic, just names and dates. Lena Sanders. Johnny. Birth certificate. File numbers. There was no note. It didn't need one. She waited, not for an explanation. She already had that. She waited for the truth to come out of his mouth like something real and human and owned. "I want you to say it," she said quietly. "Say it to me." He looked down at the papers again. There was no point denying it now. He took a breath that didn't steady anything and said, "He's mine." She nodded, once. No anger, no sarcasm. Just acceptance of what had always been inevitable. How long? He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I found out a few weeks ago. I wasn't sure at first. And now? I'm sure." There was a long silence. She picked up a dishcloth and started drying a plate that was already clean. Her hands moved automatically. He watched her, not knowing what she was thinking. He couldn't guess anymore. Not with her. "You didn't tell me," she said finally. "I didn't know how. You've never had trouble with words before." He said nothing. She set the plate down and turned to face him. "Do you want to be in his life?" There was no hesitation this time. "Yes." "Then you'll have to choose." He blinked. "Between me," she said flatly, "or him." She didn't say it cruelly. It wasn't a threat. It was just a fact. She wasn't asking for explanation or negotiation. She was laying out the road and saying, "Pick your direction." "You're serious." "Of course I am." He tried to speak, but the words tangled. "Vanessa." "I'm not angry," she interrupted. "Not anymore. I was, but I'm past that. I just know what I can and can't live with. And I can't be married to someone who splits himself between guilt and obligation and thinks it passes for love. I won't spend the next 20 years sitting across the table from a man who wonders if he should be somewhere else." He stepped forward, but she moved past him, walking into the bedroom. When she returned, she wasn't holding luggage or throwing anything, just quiet, calm, finished. She slipped the ring from her finger and set it on the counter beside the now empty envelope. "I don't want a speech. I don't want a plan. Just figure it out. Then call me, or don't." She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. "Don't contact me until you're sure." Then she left. Matthew stood in the empty apartment, the silence like a physical thing pressing in on every surface. He looked down at the ring, then the papers, then nothing. He didn't sleep that night, or the night after. He called no one, made no appointments, showed up to the office late and left early. When Greg texted to confirm the next visit with Johnny, Matthew didn't respond right away. He sat on the floor with the file in his lap, flipping through it again and again, Lena's name, Johnny's. The dates, the lines that connected them all in ink and paper, but had failed to draw a single line through his own life until now. He couldn't undo it, couldn't go back. And he wasn't sure if doing the right thing now meant he was a better man, or just one who'd finally run out of places to hide. What he did know, as the sun started to rise and the city began to hum again outside the windows, was this. The boy was real, alive, laughing, waiting, and maybe that mattered more than anything else that had come before. Vanessa's absence lingered in every room. She hadn't taken much, just her essentials and the earrings she always left on the nightstand, but the apartment felt hollow without her. Matthew didn't move anything. Her mug still sat by the sink, her book still on the armrest, a sweater folded on the edge of the bed, like she might come back for it. He didn't call, not at first. He told himself he was giving her space, respecting her terms, but really, he was afraid of what silence would confirm. Then the photo came out. He didn't know who took it, maybe someone in the park, maybe a staff member from the toy store. But it was clear. A full shot of him kneeling beside Johnny on the sidewalk, holding a paper bag full of action figures, smiling at something the boy had said. Johnny's face was half turned, his mouth open mid-sentence, hair wind-blown, unmistakable. By noon, the headlines were everywhere. Billionaire's secret son, toy store trip reveals, possible love child. Matthew Hale spotted with Minnie, me. Calls poured into the firm. Reporters waited outside the building. Paparazzi staked out the apartment. Someone tried to bribe a receptionist for security footage. His assistant fielded press inquiries until her voice gave out. By the end of the day, Matthew had pulled the plug on 3 meetings and cancelled a scheduled speech at a charity gala. He shut his phone off that night and didn't turn it back on until morning. Vanessa didn't call, but her silence shifted. One of her friends posted something cryptic online, something about betrayal, motherhood, and the press. It wasn't hard to piece together. Within days, her yoga studio was swarmed. She stopped going, then she shut down her accounts, disconnected her number, and dropped out of her firm's ongoing merger deal. No one knew where she'd gone. Matthew tried. Dozens of calls, then emails. No response. He even messaged her sister, who replied once with a curt sentence, "She doesn't want to be found." After that, nothing. Greg and Jonas saw the headlines too. They called a meeting at a coffee shop downtown. No Johnny, no smiling pleasantries. Greg was calm. Jonas wasn't. They were angry not just at the exposure, but at the risk. Reporters had shown up at their brownstone. Neighbours started asking questions. Jonas threatened to pull the plug on the entire arrangement. Greg was only slightly more measured. "You said you didn't want attention. You said you weren't going to make this messy." Matthew didn't argue. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't known the photo was taken. He said he'd pay for a lawyer, extra security, whatever they needed. "We don't want your money," Jonas snapped. "We want our lives back." Greg was the one who asked the real question. "Why didn't you tell us this might happen?" Matthew didn't have a good answer. They said they'd take the weekend to think. They said maybe it was time to hit pause on the visits. Let things settle. Talk again in a few months. But Johnny had his own opinions. He showed up at Matthew's place 2 days later with a handmade sign that said, "No quitting allowed," and 3 peanut butter cookies in a Tupperware container. Greg followed reluctantly, arms crossed, waiting by the elevator. Johnny didn't seem fazed by the noise, the flashes, the attention. He just looked up at Matthew and said, "Are they really going to make you stop seeing me?" Matthew crouched, meeting him at eye level. "They're scared." "I'm not scared. You don't have to be. Can't you all just share me, like equal turns? You can all be my dads. There's enough of me." Matthew smiled, even though his chest felt like it was caving in. "It's not about there being enough of you. Then what is it?" He didn't know how to explain it, not without breaking something. Greg, from the hallway, gave a small nod. 1 hour, that's all. So they went to the museum, then to a comic shop. Then they got ice cream and sat on a bench in the park while the wind kicked up leaves around their feet. Johnny told him about a girl in his class who could whistle through her teeth, and about the raccoon they saw once on garbage night, who now had a name, Sneaky Pete. Matthew listened. He laughed. For the first time, in a long time, he didn't think about his company, or his reputation, or how much he'd lost. It was just a boy eating mint chip and asking impossible questions about the moon. The next weekend, they flew a kite. Badly. It nosedived into a bush 5 times before Johnny declared victory anyway. On the walk back, Johnny asked if he could keep one of Matthew's ties. "To remember your job when you're not around." Matthew gave him the ugliest one he owned, a brown thing he'd never liked. Johnny called it the dirt snake. In between those moments, though, the guilt stuck. Every time he dropped Johnny off, every time the boy waved from the doorstep, Matthew saw flashes of the life he'd broken. Vanessa, quiet at the kitchen island. Vanessa, holding the envelope. Vanessa, walking out the door. He still wore his ring. Habit, maybe. Or something else. He didn't know what it meant anymore. Then, late one night, while sorting through a file of legal paperwork his lawyer had sent about potential guardianship complications, his phone buzzed. No name. Just a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. "I read the full adoption file. He looks exactly like you." No greeting. No question. Just that. He stared at the screen for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard. He didn't know what to write back. Not yet. The message stayed on his phone all night. Matthew kept looking at it, rereading it, like it might change, like some new meaning would surface on the 6th or 7th time through. He didn't write back. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what it meant, if it was an opening or a final observation. "He looks exactly like you." There was no warmth in it, but there was no anger either. Just something settled, resigned, maybe even a little tired. He thought about sending a dozen different replies, but in the end, he powered off the screen and sat in silence. A few days later, Johnny's 8th birthday came around. Matthew had been planning it for weeks. Greg and Jonas weren't birthday party types, so Matthew asked if he could organise something just for the 3 of them, something different. Johnny had once mentioned liking the cello. In that random way, kids mention things without knowing what they mean, so Matthew called in a favour. A friend of a friend secured a private afternoon rehearsal with 2 musicians from the New York Philharmonic. The plan was to take Johnny to the empty concert hall, let him sit in the middle row, while the cellists played whatever he wanted, Beethoven, Bach, even Happy Birthday, if he asked, then lunch. Then the planetarium, where Matthew had reserved one of the theatre domes for a private show, just the stars, the universe, and one kid with a head full of questions. But the morning didn't go as planned. Greg texted him early. "He's not feeling great. Fever. Might be nothing, but we'll keep you posted." Matthew replied instantly. "Should I bring anything? Can I stop by? Hold off for now, Greg sent back. We'll see how he feels. By noon, the plan was cancelled. The fever hadn't gone down. Johnny was listless, no appetite, shivering despite 3 blankets. Jonas wanted to wait it out, but Greg had already packed a bag and was grabbing the car keys. By the time they reached the hospital, Johnny could barely lift his head. Matthew met them in the ER lobby, coat half-zipped, tie askew. He hadn't even realized he was wearing a tie until he saw Greg looking at it. The wait was short. Kids always got triaged fast, but the answers weren't. It wasn't the flu. It wasn't something simple. The doctors ran a series of tests, drew blood, ordered scans. By nightfall, they had a name. An autoimmune disorder triggered by a past viral infection. Rare, not terminal, but serious. Johnny's immune system had essentially turned on itself, confused and overactive. He would need regular infusions, steroids, careful monitoring. He'd miss school. He'd be tired, on and off, for months, maybe longer. Greg sat in the corner, his face blank. Jonas paced. Matthew just stood by the bed, watching the boy sleep through the IV drip, arms covered in cartoon bandages and adhesive tape. He didn't leave that night, or the next. He called his assistant from the hospital lobby and told her to clear his schedule indefinitely. He cancelled a keynote address that had taken months to organize. He informed the board he wouldn't be reachable for the foreseeable future. Then he took the hospital's flimsy recliner chair, pulled it beside the bed, and slept there for 3 nights. Nurses came and went. Machines beeped. Johnny stirred in and out of sleep, mostly too tired to talk. When he was awake, he tried to make jokes. Bad ones. Something about how the IV pole looked like a robot skeleton. Matthew laughed when he could, but mostly he just held the boy's hand when he let him and didn't try to do anything more. On the 4th night, Matthew was dozing off again when he heard soft footsteps at the door. He turned, expecting another nurse, maybe a tech with a clipboard. Instead, it was Vanessa. She wasn't wearing makeup. No heels. Just jeans, sneakers, and one of the sweatshirts he remembered from weekends when nothing needed doing. Her hair was tied back. She was holding something, a small plush hedgehog, its fur worn down in patches. She didn't speak right away, just walked in and placed the hedgehog at the foot of the bed. "Harold," she said, "in case he wakes up and needs a bodyguard." Matthew stood, unsure what to say. "How did you know?" "I called Greg," she said simply. "We talk sometimes. I told him I wasn't here to make a scene." He nodded. The room felt too small, suddenly, like there wasn't enough space to hold this moment. Vanessa looked at the monitors, the wires, the slow rhythm of the beeping machine. "He's beautiful," she said, almost under her breath. Matthew didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt too tight for anything that required precision. She sat down in the extra chair by the window. Not across the room, not too close, just there. Quiet. "He makes these stories up," Matthew said after a while, his voice low, "about space whales and a raccoon named Pete. He gave me a sticker once that said, 'Participant, because I lost a game.'" Vanessa smiled faintly. "Sounds about right." They sat there for a while, in the hum of machines and filtered air. No raised voices, no accusations. Just the stillness that comes after everything has already fallen. "I never thought you'd show up," he said eventually. "I wasn't sure I would either. But you did." She nodded. "You made the right choice." That was all she said before getting up. She didn't linger, didn't try to clarify what that meant. She just gave the boy one last look, then turned and walked out as quietly as she came. Matthew didn't follow her. He stayed beside the bed, staring at the hedgehog she'd left behind. Harold. Ridiculous name. Johnny would love it. Maybe tomorrow, when the fever broke, he'd wake up and laugh and make up some wild backstory about how Harold used to be a prince or a ninja or a secret detective. But for now, all Matthew could do was wait, and he would, for as long as it took. When Johnny was finally released from the hospital, thinner and pale but grinning as if he'd won something, Matthew stood by the elevator with his coat draped over one arm and a backpack full of board games and peanut-free snacks slung over the other. He didn't know what came next exactly, only that it couldn't look like before. Vanessa hadn't reached out again. No calls, no letters, not even a second message, and Matthew hadn't tried to push. Something about that night, her quiet entrance and quieter exit, had felt like closure. Not a slammed door, not a locked one either, just a step into a new room she didn't invite him into. He returned to the penthouse with Johnny's jacket still folded over his arm. The space was immaculate, curated, soulless. Vanessa had always added warmth where he didn't. Without her, it was nothing but clean surfaces and expensive silence. He stood in the middle of the living room and looked around, trying to remember what he was supposed to do in this space. He didn't belong there anymore. He knew it. He had known it since the hospital, maybe since before. So he started packing. He didn't touch her things in anger. There was no catharsis in folding her sweaters or wrapping up her teacups in newspaper. He did it slowly, carefully, like he was closing a book that meant something. Each item went into a box labelled with her name. He had them delivered to a storage unit the following week. The ring stayed on the kitchen counter until the day he moved out. He picked it up without a word and left it in the drawer where they used to keep the emergency flashlights and extra chargers. Then he turned to his own things. He went through his closet and kept 4 suits, just enough for weddings, funerals, and formal parent-teacher meetings. The rest he donated. Some still had the tags on. Shoes too. Watches. Ties. All of it. Gone. He didn't want to be that man anymore. The one who measured worth in meetings and floor space and stock prices. There were parts of him worth keeping. Discipline maybe. Focus. But everything else? All the sharpness he'd thought made him successful had only carved space between himself and the people who mattered. He found a brownstone near Greg and Jonas, smaller than what he was used to, but big enough to have a second bedroom for Johnny. It had chipped paint on the porch railing and creaked in 2 spots when you walked down the hallway. He liked it instantly. There was a little garden patch out back that looked neglected. He planted tomatoes, even though he didn't like them much, just to have something to care for. The press got bored eventually. The story faded. New scandals popped up. New billionaires made headlines. His phone stopped buzzing. The board filled his seat without fuss. He didn't mind. He hadn't loved the job for years. It had always been about control, not joy. Johnny's health stabilised. The medications worked, the infusions spaced out. He went back to school with a doctor's note and a backpack half full of medical supplies and half full of snacks. His energy came back slowly. The jokes returned faster. He started painting. Nothing ordinary, bright, odd pieces full of colours that didn't belong together. One showed a skyscraper with arms cradling a planet, like a football. Another had whales floating past Mars. Matthew bought a cheap frame and hung the first one in his kitchen. Greg raised an eyebrow when he saw it. He has your weird streak. Matthew didn't argue. Jonas still watched him closely, but the tension softened over time. The 3 of them found a rhythm, uneven, sometimes awkward, but real. There were ground rules. boundaries, calendars. But there was also an understanding. None of them were going anywhere. Johnny had 3 anchors now, whether any of them planned for it or not. The school hosted an art fair in the spring, paper streamers, folding chairs, an old stereo playing music too quietly. Matthew showed up 10 minutes early, not to save a seat, but because he didn't want to miss anything. Greg and Jonas came in just after him. Johnny's paintings were taped to the far wall under a sign that read, "3rd grade, big ideas." When his turn came, Johnny stood up, cleared his throat like he was addressing a boardroom, and introduced his dads. "This is Dad," he said, pointing to Jonas, "and this is other Dad," pointing to Greg. "And this is the one I look like," he grinned at Matthew. "He used to be important, but now he's just my driver and snack guy." Everyone laughed, so did Matthew. He stayed behind after the chairs were stacked and the juice boxes were gone. Johnny wanted to show him a paper mache volcano that sort of exploded, but in a quiet way. Matthew crouched beside it, nodding seriously. Impressive containment. Later that week, without telling anyone, Matthew signed over a significant portion of his remaining fortune to a pediatric foundation in Lena's name. No ceremony, no press release. Just a line in a financial statement and a letter he kept in a drawer. One day he'd give it to Johnny. It didn't erase anything, but it felt like something. He even agreed to speak at Career Day. He wore a wrinkled shirt because the iron confused him and forgot his notes in the car. When the kids asked what a CEO did, he scratched his head and said, "Mostly emails and bad decisions." "But what do you do now?" one girl asked. Matthew smiled. "Mostly peanut butter sandwiches and emergency pudding runs, and I've gotten very good at Lego." The kids approved. He walked home that afternoon, sun low in the sky, the streets quiet in that in-between hour when everything slows down. He passed a bakery and bought 3 cookies, just because he knew Johnny would ask for them. And one of the dads would pretend to say no before taking half of one anyway. He liked this version of his life. Smaller, messier, but full. And when he got home, the tomato plants were starting to bloom. A year passes without fanfare. There's no dramatic turning point, no singular day that shifts the world again. Things just change, slowly, quietly, the way real healing does. Johnny returns to full health, with a few hiccups here and there, mostly managed. He starts playing soccer, badly, but with enthusiasm, and insists on recording every family dinner with an old camcorder Matthew found at a yard sale. "Proof of life before pie," he says during every meal, no matter the season. Matthew falls into a rhythm. The brownstone still creaks in the hallway. The tomato plants never yield much, but the basil takes off. He walks Johnny to school when it's his turn on the rotation, lets him talk the whole way, even if it's about nonsense like imaginary whales or conspiracy theories involving the school lunch lady. On Thursdays, he picks up supplies for art class. On Fridays, he brings Johnny to Greg and Jonas's place, where dinner is always some hybrid of structured chaos. Homemade curry next to frozen waffles, jazz music clashing with cartoon theme songs. He's not an outsider there anymore. He's not the third wheel or the emergency contact or the uncomfortable presence hovering at the edge of things. He belongs, just not in the way he once thought he needed to. Thanksgiving sneaks up on him. Greg sends a text the week before, asking him to come early to help set up. Matthew arrives with 2 bottles of wine, the wrong kind of napkins, and a backup turkey he picked up, just in case something goes wrong with yours. Greg rolls his eyes. Jonas smirks and says, "It's sweet that you think we'd mess up a turkey." Johnny is already in full performance mode, racing through the house with the camcorder aimed at everything. Jonas carving vegetables, Greg basting the bird. Matthew trying to figure out how to fold paper napkins into something resembling leaves. At one point, Johnny asks each of them what they're thankful for. "Your dad's," Jonas says. "My blood pressure meds," Greg adds. "Definitely you," Matthew says, without hesitation. "But also, maybe, this break in the storm." Johnny nods seriously, like he's been given vital intel, then vanishes to go film the pie cooling on the windowsill. The doorbell rings a little after 4. Greg and Jonas glance at each other, like they aren't sure who it could be. Johnny's too busy zooming in on sweet potatoes to notice. Matthew wipes his hands on a dish towel and goes to answer it. It's Vanessa. She's wearing a long coat, a little dusting of flour on one sleeve. In one hand, she holds a pumpkin pie in a clear glass dish. In the other, a white envelope with no writing on the front. "Hi," she says. Matthew steps aside, letting her in. She pauses at the threshold like someone testing water with their foot, then crosses it and walks into the house. Greg greets her with a polite hug. Jonas nods, a little cautious but welcoming. Johnny turns, camcorder in hand, and shouts, "Vanessa, you made pie? Are you staying for the food part?" "I am, if there's room," she says. "There's always room," Johnny says. "I already claimed the seat next to the rolls, but you can have the other side." She smiles and sets the pie on the counter. Then she turns to Matthew and holds out the envelope. "It's for him," she says. "When he's older, it's everything. Lena, the night in Vegas, the truth. He deserves to know where he came from without filters." Matthew takes it without saying anything. She doesn't linger on the moment, just steps around him, already moving into the orbit of the kitchen, where Greg is joking about how no one ever eats the cranberry sauce, but he makes it anyway. Dinner is loud in the way only blended families can be. Johnny narrates the entire thing for his video archive, pausing only to stuff his face or loudly rate each dish on a made-up scale. The stuffing gets an 8, the pie gets a 10. The mashed potatoes get 17 because they taste like clouds. At some point, Matthew spills the gravy boat trying to pass it across the table, and Vanessa bursts out laughing. It's sharp and real and catches even her off guard. Johnny catches it all on film. "This," he says, raising the camera again, "is the best kind of weird." After dinner, the kitchen turns into an assembly line of dishes and leftover containers. Greg turns on some soft music. Jonas stacks the pies in a box to send home with Matthew. Johnny curls up on the couch with a book and is asleep halfway through the first chapter. Matthew walks out onto the porch with a mug of decaf and finds Vanessa already there, hands wrapped around a cup, staring out at the quiet street. He sits beside her. They don't speak for a long time. When she finally does, it's without weight. "I don't know what we are now." Matthew looks at her, not trying to fill the silence with promises or guesses. "But I know you're not who you used to be," she adds. "And I like who you've become." He nods. "Me too." She reaches out and takes his hand. They sit there together, not trying to name anything, just holding on to what feels steady for once. Inside, Johnny stirs, still holding the book, still nestled between 2 pillows and the weight of 3 households that somehow turned into one. It isn't perfect. It isn't neat. But it's honest. And there's always one seat left at the table. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.